Okay, our second speaker today is Samantha Crossland, who is an organizational communication major. She'll be graduating from the Honors College in August. She's a member of Omicron Delta Kappa and Lambda Sigma. She served as a student ambassador for MTSU. Her research pertains to the hookup culture, a topic that is particularly enlightening and one that I think we should all know more about. And so I think all of you will be impressed with what Sam has done and all the research that she's put into this project. After graduation, she plans to work at C.H. Robinson, a logistics and freight company, and her thesis title is Communicating Consent, a Comparative Thematic Analysis of Sorority and Fraternity Hookup Culture, and she worked with Jessica Kratzer in Communication Studies. So please join me in welcoming Sam.
Hello. My thesis is very different from Chloe's, but like she mentioned, it is very difficult to take something you've worked like 2 years on and put it into a 20-minute presentation, so I'll do my best. But basically a general overview of what I did with Dr. Kratzer is this study. We interviewed 22 fraternity women, or 23 sorority women, and 33 fraternity men about the hookup culture as a process. So this interview talked about everything from where do you go to initiate a hookup? How do you hook up? What is a hookup to you? Is alcohol involved? How often do pregnancy scares come about? Are you tested for STDs? Everything you can think of. So from this set of data, what I decided to focus on was consent, and more so within the concept of consent, what is the effect of alcohol on consent, and how is consent obtained? Is it obtained through verbal communication, or is it obtained through nonverbal communication? So for this actual study, we use typical case sampling, which basically allows the students that are doing the interviews to pick acquaintances or people that they know that are in sororities and fraternities. How this project was set up, how the data was collected, was Dr. Kratzer had 2 different classes. One focused on the fraternity men, and the other class focused on the sorority women. The students interviewed one participant, they transcribed the data, and then it went into this giant data pool, which I got to analyze all of. And doing it this way, first of all, you find participants that are actually willing to talk to you. And second of all, it gives a pretty accurate representation of the population that you're looking at. How this data was actually examined, we did a comparative thematic analysis, which more or less means that the women's answers and the men's answers were kept separate. And we found themes within both, and then we compared the two. This came from the grounded theory approach, which basically means that you establish themes when you're looking through your information, and then as you're doing the actual analysis process, you're using the direct quotes to support the themes that you've created, which whenever I start talking about stuff, you'll see that I have quotes on the board. Feel free to read them. I won't read them to you, but they speak for themselves. So as I mentioned, they were kept separate. So pretty much a very large portion of the thesis process for me was me sitting on my laptop in Word, color coding transcripts for hours and hours and hours. And after I gave particular themes a color, I would pull those themes and put them into a Word document. It's a very high-tech system going on. So after everything was separated, I just started to write. And what I found was that there's a problem with consent in more than one avenue. And I decided to focus on alcohol and verbal versus nonverbal communication in the process of consent. And these are the questions that I kept in mind as I was doing the data analysis and as I was writing. So we decided to focus on how frequent alcohol is utilized during the hookup process. What's the difference between how men and women report this usage? What do the participants think their partner's level of sobriety has plays a role on their what consent is? What is the understanding of the participants' the actual legalities of consent, not what they think consent is, but what is the actual legal repercussions of having consent or not having consent? And what role does verbal and nonverbal communication play in this process? And then Dr. Kratzer and I, we wanted to explain, why there's this disconnect in the consent process. So we use the social penetration theory to kind of give that explanation, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So just to start it off, hookups and alcohol use. Men and women both state that alcohol is definitely part of the process, but their responses are much different. So women are pretty straightforward. They say, yeah, alcohol is involved. Everybody knows it. We get drunk and then we have sex. It's pretty much what we found over and over and over again. But the men, they also agreed that alcohol is definitely part of the process, but they often incorporated a tagline at the end of their answer saying things like, yeah, it's part of the process. But as you can see on this last line, or last couple lines, not that it's specifically to get her drunk so I can do this, but just it's there to be there, not specifically for a purpose. So it's kind of like that defense mechanism immediately kicking in without, the question wasn't asked, why? So they automatically gave that response, and that kind of plays into the idea that men are seen as the aggressors in relationships, and women are often seen as the person who's being pursued. So that automatically plays into a rape culture. So men are seen as the rapist, while women are seen as the victim. No matter what the actual situation is, it's just like a society norm. Something that was pretty alarming whenever going through this information is we asked, why is alcohol there? And more often than not, they would say the term like liquid courage. It's to make me act in a way that I would not act in if I were sober. So they would, not even realizing that they were saying it, they obviously drink so that they can hook up and not feel bad about it, more or less. So obviously they consume alcohol in order to change their behavior. Something that was pretty fascinating is whenever the participants were asked, what does your partner's level of sobriety play into their ability to give consent? And legally, participants, if they drink alcohol, it automatically voids verbal consent, even if it's given. But most participants over and over again would state things like, well, there's a certain cutoff, there's this level that I can tell whenever they're too intoxicated to give me their consent. So as long as they're not throwing up, as long as they can walk a straight line, as long as they're not blackout drunk, as long as they're coherent, then if they say yes, then it's okay for me to have sex with them. When they themselves are drinking, so they're intoxicated, which is clouding their own judgment. And how can you tell if the other person's blackout drunk? Most participants indicated that there was this gray area, so you had to be careful, but there was a certain cutoff that they could definitely tell what was happening. Something else that popped up a few times was several of the fraternity men, when you would ask them questions like, well, why is it not okay for alcohol to be involved? The response usually didn't come about as in, well, that would be rape. That's harmful for the woman. It was more about, well, our charter would be taken away from the fraternity. So this indicated the reasoning in their mind, whether it was on purpose or not. This kind of indicates that the training behind don't drink and have sex is more geared towards let's keep the fraternity safe, not let's keep women from being victims. Something else that popped up more often was that when participants were asked, well, how well do you know your campus consent policy? This quote really speaks for itself, so feel free to read it. Participants often had no idea that there was a consent policy. They didn't know what it meant, and whenever they were told what it was, they would say that it was stupid or not, why, that's dumb, which is kind of alarming because this policy is put into place to protect both parties involved of this situation. So whenever both parties agree that this rule is, pointless, then how is it valid, when it's obviously not being enforced from a student perspective? Then we'll move on from alcohol into the verbal versus nonverbal communication. Legally, most campus policies will indicate that verbal communication has to take place for consent to be valid. So, do you want to have sex with me? Yes, I do. There's consent. That doesn't happen. And research past and present indicates that that is not the case. And our research definitely shows that it is definitely not the case. So, students would often say, well, we know what we're doing. We're adults. We know that it's heating up. We know what's happening. We don't have to talk about it. It's nonverbal. We're fine. We understand what's happening. What was scary with that, though, is participants in our study and other studies show that not resisting is considered consent. So if you have alcohol thrown into the mix and somebody's not resisting and you think that they're able to have sex with you and they've consented by not resisting, that just comes into a whole lot of different problems. So what we found was, when we asked them, why don't you talk about it? Well, it's awkward. Because, if you go to the actual definition of what a hookup is, what we use for this project is, a hookup is when two people meet, have sex with the intention of never speaking again, never having contact again, never building a personal relationship. So obviously it's awkward because they don't know each other. So they're not going to talk about it, which perpetuates this ongoing cycle of not communicating, which leads to miscommunication, sexual assaults, and rape. So, let's see. Basically what we found from a lot of these results is maybe we should look at the training programs in place and what they're talking about in consent. Obviously, most college campuses are at least acknowledging this problem because cases in court systems keep rising, so obviously they have to take some sort of look at it, but maybe we should look at the reasoning behind the actual consent, what is actually being spoken about the consent. Let's see. So before I run out of time, I wanted to talk about the social penetration theory, which basically discusses that in order to have an intimate relationship, two parties have to reciprocate personal information about themselves. So this theory is ultimately saying that it is impossible for people in a hookup to create an intimate relationship because they're not talking to each other. So that leads to an awkward situation that they want to avoid at all costs because they don't want that intimate relationship because intimacy is frowned upon within the hookup culture. So once again, it's this perpetuation of never communicating, which leads to all kinds of problems. So it can be argued that women can often strive to create that intimate relationship from a hookup. So someone could say, well, that's sort of intimate because she's talking to him and I heard the term catching feelings a few times. But that can't really be valid because it has to be reciprocated. So even if a woman is trying to create that intimate relationship, if the guy wants absolutely no part of it, then intimacy can't really be formed. So basically what we found is the only communication taking place in the hookup process is on a superficial level. So partners are basically establishing that they want to have sex in some shape or form. They are using the communication to select a partner and determine if that partner is worthy of actually hooking up. So the explanation is basically participants report that lack of intimacy between two partners is basically creating this awkward situation. So more or less, Altman and Taylor's theory, because of this lack of reciprocated disclosure, which are just two people expressing, personal things about themselves, if without that taking place, intimacy isn't possible, which is why the hookup culture does not create a whole bunch of, intimate relationships.